Hey guys, so here's a video that is going to review some of the fundamental topics of our evolution unit 9. So the first evolution unit. So I got here on this board a list of the objectives from our curriculum, and I got some pictures. And so I'm just going to do a quick rundown of some of the information that would have been relevant to these topics, right? It's not super in depth, it's just a refresher. Cool. So, looking at topic 1, we have the objective of explaining Charles Darwin's contribution to science and the philosophical and scientific influences that led to his development of the theory of natural selection. Okay. So, the dude in the picture right here, this little guy right here with his potted plant, and this old bearded man right here, that's Charles Darwin. He's a well-off guy from England. He was a naturalist, so that is to say he liked to make observations about nature. And he lived in a time where evolution as a concept was not super popular. Right? People still believed primarily in a form of creationism. But he looked at the world around him like things like pets, and he saw that humans could breed dogs to change over time, right? And so he recognized that organisms change, and he wanted to establish a mechanism by which they did so. And so he had a buddy that owned a boat, and the boat's name was the Beagle, and they went on an expedition to go make some observations about nature. And they sailed down to a place called the Galapagos Islands, and they looked at a bunch of animals, some finches, which is a type of bird, some turtles, right? And he came up with some ideas, what we now call natural selection. He called descent with modification, right? And he wrote a book about it called On the Origins of Species. However, he was really wussy about publishing his findings, and he just sat on it for a long time until some other guy came along, and that guy looked up to this guy. He was like, "Hey, Chuck, old buddy, I got this great idea about how organisms change over time," and he gave Charles the paper to read over before he wanted to publish it, and Charles was like, "Dang, dude, I came up with this a while ago, but I've been a wuss about publishing it. So, yeah." And the guy was like, "You know what, Chuck? You're the man. I'm going to let you publish first." And so he gave Charles some time to get his stuff published, and then he published his findings. And so, yeah, that's Charles Darwin. He was just a general scientist dude. Figured out common sense stuff. Good guy. All right, natural selection. Identify the conditions under which natural selection occurs. Okay? And so when you have a population that has different variations of the same trait, okay, and they live in an environment, that environment is going to apply pressure to different phenotypes in different ways. And so if you live in a green forest and one of your phenotypic variations is green, you're going to camouflage better. You're not going to get eaten by predators as easily. So that environmental pressure is going to select for the green phenotype. It's going to shift that population towards being green. That's natural selection. Requires variation and environmental pressures that favor one variation over another. Explain how natural selection leads to an increase in the number of individuals within a population that express a favored phenotype. I just did that. Already did that. Green trees, more green. So I guess it's important to elaborate. The ones that aren't green, they're going to die. And if you're dead, you can't make babies. Right? So if only the green ones live long enough to make babies, the babies are going to be green or more green. There's going to be more green babies who will also have more green babies. Right? So you make more babies, there are more of you. And if you're green, they're green too. Model how environmental changes can result in the evolution of a species over time. If that same green forest all of a sudden turns magenta, right, the variation that was magenta will now do better. Right? And now if the variation magenta didn't exist already, it's not going to suddenly show up just because the forest turned magenta. Right? That's not how evolution works. You don't change to meet your environment's needs. Or rather, yes, you don't change in order to meet the environmental pressures. If you have the variation that does better in the environment, you live, and if you don't, you die. Right? So if there's no magenta bugs, everyone's going to die. But if there was already magenta bugs, right, the next generation is going to have more magenta bugs because the magenta bugs are going to be the ones that live. They make babies out of magenta. Okay? Changing the environment can change which version is being selected for. Okay? Use evidence to explain how a genetic mutation is a source of heritable variation and may result in creating an advantage among individuals. Right? So if all of my bugs are green because they have gene 1, and gene 1 codes for green protein, the only way for my bugs to become something other than green is to have a mutation to gene 1. Okay? I mutate one of those nucleotides, I turn a T to an A, and now maybe it makes magenta protein instead. Okay? Magenta baby is born. I have a new phenotypic variation. Okay? Now, if the forest is still green, that magenta baby is probably going to die, and magenta mutations are probably gone. No big deal. Who cared? Didn't need that magenta baby. However, if we live in that magenta forest now, and all of a sudden I have a magenta baby, that magenta baby is going to do better than all of the green babies that came before it, right? And so it's going to make more babies in the long run because it's going to live. And its baby is going to be magenta, and they're going to make more babies than the other green babies, and so I'll have more magenta babies, and I just keep building up the magenta because I live in a magenta forest. All started with that mutation of the allele that changed the protein from being green to being magenta. Right? Use evidence to explain how environmental changes may result in the extinction of a species. Okay, so back to the green forest, magenta forest. So I have my green bugs. They're doing really, really well in my green forest. I don't have magenta bugs. I just have green bugs. But the forest turns magenta. There's no magenta gene, right? There's no allele for magenta. So all my bugs are green. And the birds now can see them really easily against those magenta leaves. So they all get eaten. Every one of them. They're all eaten. They're dead. They're gone. That's it. Extinction. Bye. And so if there's no variation that fits the environmental pressure, you could very well lead to a situation where that organism goes extinct due to environmental change. Analyze graphs and data to describe how selection pressures can favor different types of traits resulting in natural selection. So that's these graphs here. Right? So we have these different variations of selection. So you have stabilizing selection. So like in the green forest, if the forest stays green, I'm going to shift more and more and more towards green. Right? When I change that forest to magenta, right, this is my magenta beetles. Okay? As my forest changes more and more magenta, I get more and more magenta beetles. Right? It shifts towards magenta. And in this one, it'd be like if I had magenta beetles and purple beetles, and in the middle I had green beetles. If my forest turns blue, right, my magenta beetles and my purple beetles are both going to do better than my green beetles in the blue forest. So it's going to shift towards purple beetles and magenta beetles. But my green beetles are going to die off. Okay. Identify evidence of evolution, or rather support common ancestry in biological evolution. And so we got some homologous structures down here. Right? And so if I look at the bone structure of these organisms, right, you can see that they all have the same bones, but they've taken on different forms. Right? So the morphology of these are different because they have different functions, but the underlying structure is all of the same origin. Right? If you look, these are all mammals. Right? So this is pretty much a mammalian bone structure. If you were to look at a bird, it'd have a different bird structure. It would have a different bone structure because it's not a mammal. Right? And they would have different bone structures than reptiles. Right? And so the more related you are, the more you have these conserved mechanisms. Right? And so if you think about like the evolution of these traits, once you get a trait That's what you're working with, right? And so these different organisms, these different mammals have faced different environmental pressures. So their foundational trait, right, what they're given to work with is the same, but they've used it differently. Right? Like you can't evolve something you don't have, which is why we don't have laser eyes, obviously. Construct an explanation of how common ancestry and biological evolution is supported by multiple lines of empirical evidence. So we have this homology, right? That's pretty empirical. Like I can look at that and I can count the number of metacarpals and see that they're the same. Right? That's empirical. But we have better empirical data, such as DNA. Right? And so if you look at organisms that are more closely related, they will have conserved a more similar DNA sequence. Right? So if a certain mutation popped up here in the evolutionary timeline, right, the things after it are more likely to have that sequence in them. Okay? They could potentially mutate away from that, but that's rare. Right? Whereas the things before them in that line, they don't have that sequence. Right, so the closer you are in the evolutionary timeline, the more akin your DNA sequences are. And that's something you can put math to. Right? You can use a raw percent for how similar DNA sequences are. As a whole genome, that kind of gets tricky because you can have similarities that don't really mean anything. Right? But more impressively, or more importantly, you can look at particular markers that have been isolated by genomic scientists, right, that exist within the non-coding region of the DNA, what we used to call junk DNA. Right? And there's no driving force, there's no selection for these regions because they don't present any kind of phenotypic expression. Right? They're just there. They're there as part of the structural mechanisms of DNA expression, but they don't themselves code for any traits. And so you can accumulate different mutations in there. And the more closely related these organisms are, the more likely they are to have very, very, very similar sequences in these non-coding regions. And you can use this to establish a nice timeline because the rate of mutation is relatively stable over time. Another empirical evidence that we can use is it's basically not that far off from saying DNA, since it's about like enzymes and different metabolic processes and the conservation of those metabolic processes and enzymatic structures and functions. And so the more related an organism is, the more likely their proteins will be of similar shape and function. Right? So you can look at like an amino acid sequence that's empirical and evaluate whether or not my protein is the same as an orangutan's protein for digesting, I don't know, starch, as opposed to a yeast's protein for digesting starch, right? So my protein for that is probably more akin to the orangutans than to the yeasts, but we all might have a very similar protein because ultimately somewhere down the line, we all had a common ancestor. I think that's it. I don't know. You're welcome. Bye.